Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you're ready for a full afternoon of food history because we are ready to provide it to you. Our next roundtable, Serving Up Traditions, will deconstruct how migration affects traditions in food culture, and we'll concentrate on the ways this plays out in the private sphere, specifically the home. So following the pattern of the morning roundtables, I'm just going to go over it again. Maybe there's new people in the audience. It'll be about an hour for each conversation with 15 minutes at the end for questions. So you can ask a question two different ways. You either tweet to hashtag food history, and Ashley, wave again, please. Thank you. We'll collect them and read them at the end. The other way to do it is to write your question on the notes page, which is page 12 of your weekend guide, and rip it out, or if you have spare paper, that works just as well. And then the ushers wave. I don't know where they are. They'll make themselves known. They will be there, and they will pick it up, and that will also go to Ashley at the end. That's how you ask your questions, and we hope you ask questions. They've been wonderful so far throughout, so thank you for your questions. Let's see. So I'm honored to introduce the moderator, Lavanya Ramanathan. She's a features writer and editor for the Washington Post. So take it away.
Hi, guys. Thank you. Thank you for being here. This particular panel is going to focus on the subject of how we serve up and maintain traditions. And because some of our folks here have a specialty that has a lot to do with Native American foodways and African American foodways, we're also going to look at not only the migrant traditions, but the ones that we are maintaining here that we would call native. I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists today. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm a writer for the Washington Post. Food is not my specialty. It is something, I think, as with a lot of people, I was drawn to because I am an immigrant's kid. I grew up eating one way, and I find all the other ways of eating way more fascinating. So that's why I like to write about food. To my left here is Daniel Bender. He is a director of Culinaria Research Center and professor of history at the University of Toronto. He's received attention for a class that caught my eye. It was called Edible History, History of Global Foodways, and the midterm was to have the students cook curry. This is Toni Tipton-Martin, to his left. She is the author of the critically well-received book, The Jemima Code, and the process of her writing it involved unearthing stories and dishes from 200 years worth of African American cookbooks. She is the founder of the Sunday Youth Project, which works to combat hunger and obesity, and that work in particular has netted her 2 invites to the Obama White House from Michelle Obama herself. Yes. She promised she does not have Michelle's number, so don't ask her. I don't. To her left is David Shields. He is the Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. He was named last year's Keeper of the Flame by the Southern Foodways Alliance. And he has a book that just came out 2 days ago. It's called The Culinarians. And you guys will be able to meet with him and chat about his book probably after this talk. To his left is Lois Ellen Frank. She is the New Mexico-based chef and author and native foods historian. She has won a James Beard Award for her book, Foods of the Southwest Indian Nations, and she operates Red Mesa Cuisine, a native catering and food company. Great. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to sort of jump right into it. I would like to start with the subject of migration, and I'm going to begin with Daniel here. I would like to ask you about what are some of the ways in which migrants have sort of protected and practiced food traditions in their homes and also in the communities that they live in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm gonna take that in 3 different places. And the first is the store down the street from me, and the second is your fridges, and the third is school lunches. Because I think that gives us the chance to talk not just about maintaining traditions, but about changing traditions, and as we were talking about, inventing traditions too. So down the street from me, there's a store called Sharkar Foods. I could choose many other type of grocery stores, food stores, but it's worthwhile just choosing this one because it's close to me, and we go there to buy fish and limes. It's a Bengali food store. My wife is from Eastern India, so the fish holds that intense significance. The store is an interesting place. It's got the Bengali flag right outside, as if to send a message to come, or perhaps letting people know what's inside. And there's a lot more than food that's on offer there. Not necessarily on sale there, but on offer there. There's the loose cardboard boxes filled with greens and those incredibly fragrant Bengali limes that keep me up at night, especially if they're in the house. There's the big fish counter with those giant fish that hold so much meaning to migrants. So much meaning to migrants, in fact, that those fish are more available in a place like Toronto or New York City than they often are in Eastern India by now. But there's more. There's the pile of newspapers in the corner, the Bengali language newspapers, of which there are always several different political viewpoints. There's the advertisements on the wall for lodging, for new restaurants, for rentals, for bachelor meals, for babysitting, for tutoring, for many, many other things. There's a corner stall where you can send money home to Bangladesh. It's a Bengali store, but it could be a Tamil store. It could be any of the other stores that are near where I live. I think that captures something. It captures something about what those stores mean, and also about what the shopping means. It's not just going out to buy food. It's going out to buy food that means something, means a great deal to those who are buying it, those who are cooking it for their families, those who are cooking it for their children. And I think children's a really important part of the story, the first and second generation. But it also says something about the hard work, often women's work, of maintaining those traditions. The big grocery stores often try and sell those ingredients, but they can't sell the experience of going to those kinds of stores. They can't sell the experience of the chance to speak in your own language, the chance to catch up with friends, the chance to find that babysitter or the next place to live. But there's more too. There's also, it is that neighborhood, that store often gets called in the press, it gets called Little Bangladesh, but it isn't. It's actually just a slice of migrant life. It isn't like a store in Bangladesh. There's perhaps more packaged ingredients, and if you turn over the packages, you see where those places have come from, right? They're local. They're processed locally. They're packaged locally. They're imported, but then there's a sticker that says, well, in my case, made in Canada, but it might just as easily say packaged in California or packaged in Illinois. And that says something about how those traditions, and here I was struck by one of the questions that came out from on Twitter. I was being a modern scholar and following Twitter. And somebody asked about the economic opportunities of migrant foods, and I think that captures it. Just turning over the box gives a chance to see what your fridges might look like 15 years from now. You know, if you open up now, you see Budweiser beer, Heinz ketchup, maybe Pottock's pickles. I don't have any Budweiser beer in my fridge, but there is Pottock's pickles. And that says something about how migrant foods, then some do cross over, but not all. And that brings me to school lunches. And just to share an experience in class, real quickly, if I may.
No, I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you, actually, you know, you were talking about the struggles of the mothers and fathers to maintain these food cultures. And
that's right.
The battleground is the school lunch, guys, if you're a kid of immigrants.
Absolutely. And, you know, so my students, the university where I teach is, essentially all my students are born elsewhere. And they have an incredible range of migrant experiences that they bring into the classroom. And the food can be both something that's alienating, eating food that they might eat at home, but are perhaps slightly nervous about showing to their friends. So I just asked once in class, and I said, have you ever had the experience of being laughed at for your school lunches? And I had a student, I had several, the hand shot up. It was like a professorial dream. Everyone had a story to tell and could tie it into the reading beautifully. And two of the students, one of the students, she burst into tears and told a story. She's a West Indian student, and she was talking about bringing chicken curry to lunch and heating it up in the school microwave, and sat down to eat it, and a teacher came and, I feel like bursting into tears. The teacher came and made her go and clean out the microwave because of this. See, this is my class, the intake of breath. But when we think about it, that's not ancient history. That's 10 years ago, 5 years ago for these kids. Another student, a Persian student, talked about coming to school with kebabs, and she began the story by talking about how carefully her mom shapes them, and her mom's fingers, and the practice of shaping these kebabs. And she sat down for over a plate of rice and kebabs in the school cafeteria, and somebody told her, your kebabs look like turds. And she said, and they all admitted secretly to wanting Lunchables for lunch, even as at home, they really, really, really wanted the kebabs, the chicken curry, and that's what holds that affection in their own memories. So there's kind of a couple of provocative things that I think come out of this. For me, one is, if you want a lively city, bring in immigrants. Because they create these stores that are more than simply places to buy food. They're places of socialization, places where people want to treasure the lengthier conversation, where literary cultures can meet, newspaper cultures can meet grocery cultures. I don't think there's any surprise that the 3 cities in North America that have the highest number of food jobs, whether they're good food jobs or bad food jobs, is something we should talk about, but they're New York, Toronto, and Los Angeles, the 3 biggest migrant gateways in North America. I think the other point I would make is that the most creative cooks in America, with all due respect to those who can do things with test tubes and those kinds of things, that some of the most creative cooks in America are the ones who are working hard to maintain traditions. And those are often home cooks, and they're often women's cooks.
I want to ask David now, because I do know this to be one of the challenges, one of the interesting challenges of both migrants and I think also people who are trying to maintain their foodways here in the United States is ingredients. And I know David here has a background that involves preserving historical ingredients. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
And how does that play into what we eat and how we eat?
Right. For the past dozen years, I've headed a foundation which has preserved landrace grains and brought back the fundamental classic ingredients that had been grown in the South but had been pushed aside by industrial agriculture. And I will say, you know, I have a sort of longer view of history. I go back to the 16th century in terms of some of the migration waves that I deal with. But I'll begin with a truism. Every migrant group brings the tastes and ingredients of their homeland to the extent that they can here. It's easier to do it with fruits and vegetables. It is extraordinarily difficult to do it with grain because of the scale that's needed in terms of seed production for grain. And because grain provides those porridges, the beer and beverages, the bread, which are some of the basic chords of world cuisines, whether it's congee in Japan or oatmeal from the north of Europe, the loss of the flavors of traditional grain is the great crisis globally in terms of the taste of traditional cultures. Since the rise of the Green Revolution with Norman Borlaug at the end of the 20th century, cultures all over the world have been asked to surrender their land races, their traditional grains, for dwarfed, ultra-productive, and disease-resistant varieties, which are grown with a package of practices, such as you buy the seed from a company or the government rather than save it yourself. Why is flavor lost here? Well, one of the things that we have to think about in terms of land races is that human beings, like every biological entity on the planet, identifies what is edible and nourishing in their environment. And this is true of parameciums, mice, birds, whatever, by taste. They are chemically hardwired to respond to signatures of taste. And in traditional cultures globally, grains were improved by seed selection by consumer grower breeders. So they were always, every year, seeking a more wholesome taste. And that more wholesome taste actually equates directly with nutrition. Since the middle of the 19th century, various other agronomic needs, whether it's disease resistance, productivity, drought resistance, have supplanted taste. Taste is not even a consideration in the majority of grain breeding that goes on in any place else in a scientific world. So, what do you do? Well, what we've tried to do is to locate the surviving landrace rice, corn, sorghum, grow them out in sufficient quantity so there's actually seed available for growers in the United States at least to bring them back so they don't have to use number 2 dent corn or cocodri rice or even cowrose, which many Asian populations now embrace as their rice instead of the rice of their native countries. We give that, if you grow it organically, we've given seed rice free. We work with the Ecological community for the African diaspora crops. We work with the Germans who first brought in durum wheat into the South. We work with commercial bakers. If you can have that flavor of wholesomeness, that was the central flavor of your porridge, your beer, your bread, the taste of your home, the rye or the spelt or the millet, you have the basis for a community. Flavor is a strong and mystic sort of magnetic force. And I know that you entirely abide by this philosophy.
Would you like to talk about that at all?
When we talk about flavor and some of these ancient strains, I don't know if the general public really understands that when something is heirloom, when something is an ancestral grain, that it's been, and I'll go back even further. So you're going 15th century, I can go back 9,500 years and say, what were the indigenous grains? What were the indigenous crops? And how have they evolved? And the same way we evolve to, my sister married a Norwegian, for instance, and they go to Norway every summer, and the Norwegians think it's summer, and they're jumping in the fjords, and it's 40 degrees. She's on the boat shivering in a down jacket. That over time, indigenous people have been able to select out properties. It's called selective breeding for flavor, for shape, for color, for size. And areas, ecozones, ecological areas, are known specifically for these crops. Wild rice only grows in Minnesota. Wild rice that is grown in California paddies is no longer wild. It's the cultivated version of its wild ancestor. True wild rice has flavor that's nutty and delicious, unlike anything else on the planet. Corn from a native area, or chilies from Isla de Pueblo, is unlike any other chili based on the flavor of the soil, the amount of sun, the amount of water. And so you're onto something much larger than most of you know. And our palates develop sensibilities to these flavors. And when we lose that, we don't understand the orgasmic experience of eating a ripened peach. One peach, perfectly ripened on a tree. What's happened? They're grown for size. They're grown for shipping. They're grown for everything but flavor, because they might not ship well. They might dent. They might bruise. And so we get into the senses. I think the French use the word terroir. And I think the word terroir is great, because Champagne grapes can only come from Champagne, France. Chimayo chili can only come from Chimayo, New Mexico. And foods of the South, or foods in Canada, can only come from those regions. And when we purchase those, and we buy those, and we select those, and we keep those alive, we perpetuate something much larger than what we're doing. Much, much larger.
Those of you who were here this morning, you might have heard there's a little bit of talk about ingredients for immigrants especially, and about the idea of localism almost being in opposition to what immigration has done to our food system, which is bring a lot of imported foods like mangoes, limes, I've heard, avocados, things that have come from other countries and are being consumed by immigrants. I think all of these things play a role in how people find a way to maintain what it is they've eaten, what their families have eaten. I want to ask Tony about myth and about how culinary traditions get lost, and what does it take to dig them up, particularly given your background and given the undertaking that you took to write the Jemima Code.
Sure. Well, you know, the Jemima Code is a really wonderful illustration of all of the things that we're talking about here. The first Africans were not migrants. We are not an immigrant culture. And not to put too much of a downer on the conversation, but our traditions were stunted in the arrival on slave ships. That does not mean the Africans did not come with that awareness and those sensibilities and those passions for flavor and those abilities to combine ingredients and understand terroir. They did all of those things within limitations, right? So we were, in order to begin to engage the conversation about what African American tradition is to go all the way back to understanding in a realistic sense what our food experience has been, not necessarily by choice. And that would lead us to understand that African Americans, that first generation of Africans, our food culture developed out of two strains of life and lifestyle. One would have been those people that were serving in a professional capacity, working in the plantation kitchen, harvesting and dealing with the food, and they would have that understanding of product selection and ingredients and quality of ingredients. They had practiced at a classically trained level in the plantation kitchen. There was a second group of people who were also cooking in early African and African American tradition, and that would have been the people cooking in their home cabins, right? And so they would have been functioning with an entirely different set of ingredients, but with that same knowledge. All of them were functioning within the African sensibility, what scholars have called Africanisms, right? Those things that cannot be erased from memory. Things like cooking with nuts and seeds. There is research that has looked at Yoruban cultures and understands that there were cooking techniques that were applied and practiced in Africa. Are they different than they're practiced in other cultures? No. Boiling, braising, steaming, cooking in leaves. Those are things that early cultures were all practicing. So I've had audiences ask me about why I would draw attention to those. It's important to draw attention because we have not been given credit for practicing those same techniques. So it isn't that we are the first. or the only to have cooked in a particular style. It is that we have been portrayed as people who did not have that understanding. So once we start there, with giving an equal space for the African expertise and understanding that Black people came with some knowledge, then we can begin to appreciate what happened to them in American migration as they were either moved about in the country during domestic enslavement or when we were liberated and began to migrate on our own. And so what my work does is look specifically at the professional class. We have lots and lots of research on the antecedent of soul food, which would be this cabin cooking. If we think about African American cooking following two paths, then the one as the plantation cook would be the professional class. And those are the people that comprise the Jemima Code. They're the authors who, through the help of their communities or other resources, were able to produce cookbooks. Very few and far between in early America, but the cookbooks are there nonetheless. And they give us a view into what those people thought their cooking was. It is not Southern. It's not limited to Southern cooking. As a matter of fact, there's very little Southern and soul cooking in those books. What does that tell us about what those people thought of their identity? They believed that the food that they were preparing for others, preparing at work, was their food. We apply the term celebrity chef today to professionals who are cooking and claiming the food that they prepare at work. But African American cooks are the only people who are not afforded that same credibility. Anytime we talk about what it means to cook African American, we revert to the soul, cabin, survival, sorrow's kitchen philosophy. We don't expand the idea that African Americans have cooked in a traditional, classically trained way. And so the cookbooks of the Jemima Code have allowed us to see an entirely different class of African American cooks. David has done such an amazing job. He's been very helpful to me in helping us find some of these obscure cooks beyond just the cookbook authors. But the cookbook authors stand in the gap for those people who are lost in slave culture, who were ignored, whose recipes were appropriated for the broader community. But we are now beginning to look at their traditions and that Southern and American traditions and tracing back to Africa, looking for patterns of cooking and habits like cooking in one pot or cooking with rice and grain-based dishes that do reflect an African American culture. But we really do have to begin by changing our expectation and our philosophy about what it means to cook African American, because to some extent, what other cultures are able to claim as German American or Italian American, African Americans have lost that ability because our African creations were lost in American culture.
Louis, in the same vein, what are some of the ways that people and communities are attempting to recover some of their traditions? I know that in your work, you do a lot of that.
So I first want to just continue your vein, and the point that was just brought up is really important. When we talk about cuisine, and again, I'm going to borrow that French word, I was always told that both in culinary school and then when I went to New York to propose doing a cookbook on Native American cuisine, that Native Americans didn't have a cuisine and that I had no credentials. And that's why I got my PhD. The title of my PhD is The Discourse and Practice of Native American Cuisine. So now I'm an authority and I can say Native people do have a cuisine. Every culture in the world has a cuisine. Let's deconstruct that. What does that mean? Foods cooked on a daily basis from a specific locale or region. So it's not only the Italians or the French or the Germans that have a cuisine. It's Aboriginal, it's Native, it's African, it's all over. And so this is very important when we talk about what this is. I was told Native people had something called cookery.
Right.
Like cookery was less than a cuisine. And that's really unjust and very uneducated to think that. And so I just wanted to carry on because there's a lot of similarities of the struggles that both cultures have tried to prove that there is a cuisine. And this cuisine is vital and distinct and flavorful and unique and important.
I would say that I find the word cookery very valuable as a distinction for a cuisine. A cuisine is an expression of a growing system. A cookery uses ingredients from whatever, you know, not the traditional rice, but the one you get in your grocery store. Not the field pea that was always done in Hop and John, but whatever field pea you can get. So a cookery is an inauthentic expression of a set of formula using inappropriate ingredients in the shape of something, while a cuisine is actually has a kind of cultural connectedness to a growing system.
So sorry to deviate.
No, I think you actually.
I just thought it was important to carry that forward.
No, I don't think you deviated. I think you're addressing the question perfectly.
Does that make sense to all of you? Because it's
Yeah.
important that all of you understand that.
Yeah.
All right, so back to your
Well, I think you answered it. I mean, the way that people and communities are attempting to recover those traditions, I think the fact you had to go get a PhD to even prove that,
So
you had the...
there's
that
just
you had,
on that a couple of quick points. I know we just got the 15-minute warning. There's something called traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, and that myself and some other Native American academics have really made a concerted effort, both on an educational level, to reintroduce this. What does it mean? It means that there is ancestral knowledge based on ingredients from specific regions. I think a really good example would be the Inuit know how to survive on the frozen tundra. If I were dropped off and plunked down, I wouldn't know how to survive there. I can learn that TEK. I can learn that traditional knowledge on how to survive. So we have to understand the history of how these foods have evolved. And then we have to understand that this knowledge can be shared, it can be exchanged, but it's always indigenous to that specific region. The Scots have it, the Irish have it, Africans have it, the French have it, natives have it. And so specific regions, there are knowledge based on food ingredients, including how to grow them and the flavor and the agriculture about a specific ingredient that is, in the case of Native Americans, passed down orally. And just because it was never written down, it was always discounted as not being as good at. And oral tradition is as much a science as any other Western ideological form. If we didn't write down a recipe, it doesn't mean that that recipe isn't as valid. It means that that recipe was passed down through TEK.
I like to associate that with culinary school apprenticeships, right? That African Americans as enslaved people may have learned a recipe from the mistress once, right? The woman read her the recipe and we would all agree to that. But after that, the African working alone in the kitchen, because it was a dusty, dirty place to be, and no princess, slave mistress would have caught herself dead in that kitchen. At that point, the African begins to stir the cake batter to the left, even though the woman taught her to stir it to the right, because in her African tradition, there may be a religious connotation for the way that you stirred it, or a ceremonial reason. And so those are the kinds of traditions that have been ignored and obscured just because they weren't written down. And so like yourself, I was toying with the idea of getting a PhD in order to legitimize the work. And everyone still says to me, you've got a dissertation right there. Why don't you just turn it in? And
you have to do a defense.
Well, what I realized though is that journalism, there are many other ways for us to get at this truth. And I think that's what is reflected here. I've spoke about your TEK in a more pedestrian way because that's what a journalist does, right? There's lots of scholarship about what I've been speaking about this morning, but the Jemima Code places it in a more accessible, visible way. And so we all have, I think what we're all doing, in answer to your last question, is we're all finding our own unique path to re-educating the consumer so that the next level of conversation, we can all begin to talk on the same plane. Because right now we're talking about, we're talking in different languages.
I want to wrap
This
up.
one thing, sorry. This ancestral knowledge, just the idea of stirring can have so much. There's a song, there's a thought. What's the secret ingredient? In all of our grandmothers' traditions, why was grandma's food so good? What was the secret ingredient she put in there? Does anyone know?
Love.
It is. It's a non-tangible essence. It's there. This is that knowledge. This is that. And everyone has it, whether they're first generation, second generation, a million generations. It's all in there. And that is the flavor, David, that you're talking about. There's nothing like it.
I want to jump off an idea that Tony just mentioned to sort of wrap all of this up about, it's almost like a reclaiming of who gets to talk about tradition and foodways, which makes me think that that somebody else has been doing the talking, that somebody else has been telling the stories. Would you like to begin,
Yeah,
Dan? I mean, anyone can begin, but...
I think that's a really important point because I think often we have a conception, right, that people come and they have a great deal of skills and that they have a long traditions of cooking. Very often they don't. They arrive in a new place, they haven't necessarily been cooking at home, and they have to learn. And they have to learn in all kinds of different ways. And they have to learn because they have to feed themselves and their family. The other side of that, right, is that nobody cooks or eats alone. And I don't mean that we all eat in groups. It's that we eat in front of other people too, right? If you're that Bengali store may have the flag out front, but it's still open for everyone. And I think that people are conscious of that. The Bengali restaurant right next to it that caters primarily towards serving food to single men. It's primarily a sort of bachelor restaurant. It's still open to the public. It's still reviewed on Yelp. It still gets the occasional write-up in the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, meaning that food is getting interpreted by others. And that has its effects, it has its impact. And it also raises the question that I think has been lingering in a lot of the questions that we've gotten about appropriation, right? And about caricaturing, and about when is tradition capital, actual monetizable capital, and if you're cooking from another tradition, are you stealing? Are you sharing? And that's a really challenging question about the kind of respectfulness that you have to bring to eating, which is something I'm really interested in my own work about when eating the food, an unfamiliar food becomes adventuring, and when does it become like, well, since we've been using the metaphor, the mini dissertation, like the chance to really learn a lot. I think that's a really challenging question that individually we need to work on, but it's also one that collectively we could talk about.
We've been talking and hearing so much about this concept of appropriation. I think social media has certainly contributed to that. There was a dominant voice that had control of all media, right? And so many of us didn't have an opportunity to have a voice. But now through social media, we're able to hear lots of different voices and different interpretations. And that question of where does appreciation end and appropriation begin is a very, very sticky, difficult one to answer. Many of us have been trying to redirect the conversation. Appreciation is wonderful. Respect and giving credit where credit is due are important. I call those things culinary reparations. in my work. It's a hashtag.
Hashtag.
But the larger looming question for me in representing a culture that has lost a lot of its ownership over its cuisine or its cookery is that monetization is the real key here. And for us, if we can't educate the broader community that our food is valuable beyond perceptions of slumming or it has to be a barbecue shack or, just that we haven't allowed classically trained African-American chefs in fine dining settings to talk about fusion food when fusion food is what we started America with, right?
Yeah.
So to reorient ourselves so that monetization is possible and that there will be those who will invest in restaurants that don't stand in this narrow representation is for me the next step of how we deal with appropriation. It's important for us to have these conversations and to respect the creators of the dish, but we also have to share some of that economic wealth with the very community that you are representing. And the most recent thing that applies to in my mind is KFC's Nashville hot fried chicken.
I was going to say hot chicken.
Right? We do not, how many people know about Andre Prince and right. Everyone else thinks it's just some really cool thing that came out of Nashville, but look, Google.
There's a great article, and I want to say Eater.
There's an Eater article about her.
Look it up, it's really good.
It's a great understanding of how a concept that begins in a community moves into the mainstream, and then that community is completely left out of the dialogue.
And what is fusion, right? So fusion is inevitable. All of us can have the same recipe, and we can cook the same dish, but the way we do it is going to be slightly different. And I might see David has a technique that I like. So the next time I make that recipe, I take a little of David, and I make it with a little of his. That's fusion. And so I think it's inevitable over time. What makes us unique is when we're adding that essence, that ancestral part of who we are, whether it's coming from our mother or grandmother into that food, but that fusion is natural. It's taking something, whether it's a technique or something from one situation or an experience with another cook or the grinding of corn, the way we sing together, and making it our own and then passing it on. And so it's a beautiful way to phrase it. It's very eloquent.
I want to bring fusion back to the idea of ingredients as well and availability. I mean, I think a lot of things we think of as fusion are adaptations. They're adaptations for the country that we now live in, what ingredients are available to us. My mother, we didn't have Indian grocery stores when I was growing up. I'm almost 40. I was like that first sort of wave of Asian immigration, and but we had the Chinese grocery store, and we had maybe the Korean grocery store, but that's where my mother went to buy her ingredients. So we ate a different kind of rice than we probably do now. We didn't have access to the vegetables that my dad grows them. He made me bring back seeds.
Well, this is
which you're not supposed to do. Don't do it.
So that's good.
Customs is right across the mall.
That's why he gave them to me, guys. I shouldn't say this in a federal building.
We've moved sort of away from the home cook to the question of restaurants.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting place to go in terms of migrant cultures, because at least in 19th century America, where migrant groups staked a kind of communal identity in the public world at large was around a restaurant. Nunzio Finelli in Philadelphia, the greatest Italian cook, or Juan Achiak, who was the first great Chinese cook in San Francisco in the 1850s, who becomes the center of a community and magnetizes all of the media toward it. Now, the very interesting question which Tony asked about why is it that in the 21st century, African-American chefs are having a difficult time capitalizing their position. One, in the 19th century, the major caterers in the United States for events were all African-American. When we start paying attention to restaurant history and media history and the question of public presence, we learn about different changes. And I suspect that 1890s to 1910 white supremacist moment in American culture pushed African Americans off of Eating Street.
And how many Native American restaurants do you all know of? How many Native American chefs are there? We're in the same sort of situation there. We now have classically trained Native Americans that can work in restaurants equal to their European counterparts, but this is new.
That's a great place to wrap up here. We'll take some questions. I will remind you all, if you guys want to tweet your questions, you can tweet them with the hashtag Smithsonian Food. And it's helpful, too, if you put a little cue ahead of it, I feel like. I thought, when I was looking through the feed, I could see who was asking questions earlier. And are there ushers somewhere to get your questions as well?
I think we do have ushers there, so if you do have questions, please write them down and send them towards the aisle. In the meantime, we'll ask some questions that we've been having coming in from Twitter. Again, our Twitter feed is essentially exploding with questions, so I'm very excited to do my best to aggregate them and communicate them to you. So I think one of the topics we've been dancing around is the importance of space and spaces, where communities can come together and create these fusion foods to bring back traditional foods, to celebrate and to revive and to acknowledge and have their labor acknowledged by broader American audiences. You know, I want to know, what do you think are the most critical spaces where this work is being done? Is it in home kitchens? Is it in local gardens? Or is it in the industrial field? Where is the work of community building through food being done today?
Can I make one little, I mean, for me, I think, maybe I wasn't dancing around it, but some people get here, whether it's through as refugees, as immigrants, and they go to small towns. They are separated from community. And I think that actually is one of the ways in which, one of the reasons people cling so closely to their food culture is because it's all they've got. They don't necessarily have all the elements of a community around them, but they have their food. And they have what they know about cooking their food. That's certainly been the case for me and for other people I know as well. So I don't think of space. The internet is a space.
Sorry. I was going to say social media.
Yeah.
It seemed like an oversimplification, but there's so much opportunity for conversations that even if you don't have a farm, you can develop a community with the Black farmers or whatever your particular interest is. And we're finding, I think, that there's a lot of this conversation and activity happening on the internet.
Yeah, food blogs, guys.
Food bloggers.
I have gone crying into a food blog, just learned how to make something Indian because I messed it up. And there's so much out there.
Well, and I think the point on all that is about making space, right? And whether that's the new restaurant, carving out spaces within cooking schools, whether that's, you know, literally making the space of the urban garden, it's as much the process of claiming space as it is, you know, having the space there.
I think the food truck is an interesting phenomenon because it's a space that's mobile and it comes into places. And I remember my childhood when the Good Humor Man came and you heard the bell and all of a sudden every child in the community would congregate. The food trucks are having the same sort of effect, both as an ambassador of style to those who are not participants in the community, but people who are of migrant communities have a great deal of loyalty to the food truck when it comes.
And another space to consider is ritual. So the ritual in Native Americans, we have ceremonies, we have our dances, we have our feasts, which usually honor maybe a buffalo dance. And so we might bring the bison in and have a feast, a space to be able to honor that specific food and serve dishes that represent the honoring of that sacred food.
So we have another question tied into this idea of consuming locally. And in a previous panel, we talked about this idea that if we're consuming locally, then we're not necessarily as open to migrant communities and their flavors coming in and influencing our food culture. So we might actually be losing diversity, perhaps, in consuming locally. We have a question from the audience that asks us, well, what about flavors? If we focus on consuming locally and sourcing our ingredients locally, are we losing an opportunity in terms of flavors? Are we going to have a singular kind of flavor if we choose to support local artisans?
Well, I don't think, local agriculture just produces one flavor. And we have to think about, when we have a great ingredient that has been nurtured for centuries, for thousands of years, and it comes down to us with its flavor intact, that flavor can be deployed in any sort of way. You can have a traditional chef or a traditional family do the traditional things with it, but since it tastes great, you can have a molecular chef deconstruct it and make the new dish out of it. The great thing about a land race with wonderful flavor is that it can do so much for you, and it's not constrained to the practices of the past, but it permits the practices of the past to exist.
I don't think you have to have one or the other. I'm not a locavore. I do buy locally, but I am going to buy wild rice hand-harvested from the Ojibwe in Minnesota, and I have no qualms about mail ordering and ordering that. I am going to buy sustainable cacao and sustainable vanilla, and they're not local. And that's okay. I feel completely okay. I buy tepary beans from the Tohono O'odham in Arizona, and I support not only that food, the tepary bean, all the cultural traditions tied with that, the planting stick, the type of agricultural, the heirloom bean that we've kept alive, all of those. I don't have to be a locavore. I can be a sustainable consumer of indigenous foods on a global level and support all of the attachments to that. I don't think there is one or the other.
And I think that we get hung up in trying to categorize and label things, which is obviously what has happened to the African Americans in this country and our food culture. Because what I would like to say is that we're eating seasonally.
Yes.
Right? When you're thinking about eating seasonally, then all of these other variables come into play. You're going to have to learn how to be creative and understand how to prepare that dish in numerous ways during the season in which it's available. And at the end of that time, you will learn to prepare something else. And so rather than focusing too unnecessarily on whether it was grown locally or not, the fact that it's grown seasonably would sort of imply that. So if the tomatoes aren't in your community at this time, chances are they wouldn't taste very good if they were. And so you should prepare the squash that's available at that time of year. And that's the beauty of what I think the African Americans who were enslaved, who left us behind this legacy that they transferred orally. The ability that through migration, they were able to adapt the cooking style that they developed, learned, brought with them initially to whatever region they were in. So our food culture is very diverse as a result of that. You will find unique dishes in African American culture in Maryland that you don't find in Southern California. And that's part of that adaptability. They are eating locally. They're also eating seasonally. But if we get tied up in words, sometimes we lose the message.
I mean, just to be slightly ill-mannered, the store that I was talking about is a local store. It's serving people who are generally walking there. It's creating a set of local ties. The newspaper is printed locally. It just happens to be that the language was originated in the subcontinent. It's a local store, so that is somewhat eating local, but maybe I'm just...
I think we've had access to all this stuff, and we still see a sameness, especially in what's represented in restaurants. I think we're just getting to the point where we're starting to see, like you said, diversity. Well, where we're recognizing there's a difference between a dish that hails from Maryland and one that hails from Southern California. We see it. I think we're just beginning to see diversity, and that's happening in spite of the locavore movement. It's going to be fine, guys. It's going to be fine.
It's gonna be
That's my favorite thing to say.
I love that.
We have a follow-up question on the actual movement of certain ingredients from Africa to North America. And specifically, we have an inquiry about how did that happen? When you have forced migration, you don't necessarily have the chance as an enslaved person to bring ingredients with you. You don't have that ability to perhaps bring some seeds or whatnot. So how did the foods from West Africa, whether it be grains, I'm not speaking specifically about traditions, but the foods themselves, how did those seeds make their way to North America? What was the process? Who was responsible for that?
So before David answers, I would love to be able to commend the questioner for not asking the question about the seeds coming over in the African's hair. That is the silliest thing that was ever represented for us, that in the midst of being captured and chased through the jungle, they had the forethought to take a few seeds and stick them in their hair. It's just part of the ludicrous nature of some of the history that we tell ourselves, that we have told ourselves. So I just wanted to thank the questioner for that. My husband sent me an email, and I don't know if it's about your book or not, because I haven't looked yet. But there is an article this week, and I think it's in Time, about African rice being brought to the Americas by the slave ship holders. He was firing it off to me like, can you believe it now? You guys are finally claiming the Africans, had some ownership, and now it's shifting onto the ship owners. Well, that's sadly, there's some reality to that. Those people saw what the Africans were eating, if they were not consuming the food as it was prepared when they had them on the ship, if they brought them here, when they brought them here, those indigenous ingredients that they were not familiar with. It made commercial sense for a planter or a slaver to bring over ingredients with them to prepare the porridges and other things that they fed the enslaved, the captives. That's how the ingredients got here. But David might want to talk about the rice, because that's just such a wonderful story.
Well, there are many paths to get over, and of course, you have to have food sources on the slave ship in order to support, the humans who are being trafficked. And some of that is the basis. We have Sir Hans Sloane in 1692 going onto a slave ship and taking a handful of peanuts, one of which survives in the British Library right now. And when we found what we thought was the ancestral peanut of the South in a freezer in Greensboro, North Carolina, about 4 or 5 years ago, we had Sir Hans Sloane's peanut there to do a genetic fingerprint with. So we knew we had it, But sorghum, for instance, was brought over as a grain with Africans, but not as a sugaring agent. In the 1850s, a man named Lawrence Ray goes down to South Africa and brings all these sugar grasses over and starts planting them as a substitute, a cold weather sugar cane. And then this rice. There's this upland variety of rice that we know was shipped to Thomas Jefferson by a man named Nathaniel Cutting in 1787, 88. It can be grown like a garden plant, dry culture. Most rice that's grown in the South is subtropical japonica. It's an Asian rice. That's Carolina gold, Madagascar gold. But West African rices are glaberrima, different species of rice. It was grown throughout the South, then disappears. A group of people, slaves on the Georgia Sea Islands, are recruited by the British in the War of 1812 with the promise of liberation and land if they'll fight against their former masters. The British actually fulfill their promise and settle these people in Trinidad, where they call themselves the Americans. They took all the seeds from coastal Georgia with them, including that rice. And last December, B.J. Dennis, the great Gullah Geechee cook, Queen Quet, the queen of the Gullah Geechee Nation, and I went down to Trinidad and actually saw growing in the field this rice that we had been looking for over a decade. One that we know came from West Africa, obviously recognized by the Africans who were working on these plantations, embraced as their own. They take it with them, and they keep it alive for 7 generations. The man that we saw, John Elliott, 7th generation descendant of one of those Royal Marines who fought in the War of 1812.
So the value of seeds is much larger, and seeds are a currency, and in Native tradition what they say is, the money that you think you want to obtain in terms of our consumer society mean nothing. It's the seeds that will save us. The grains, the sacredness of all of these foods.
The seeds that will save us all. Well, with that incredibly wise phrase, we will draw this wonderful panel to a close. Thank you so much for your discussion, for your articulation of these amazingly complex themes. And again, I'm sitting here in awe in the front row, just wishing we could go on forever. But we have to move on. So again, I'll pass the mic to Lauren, and she'll guide us to the next panel. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we'll take a short break now. Tony Tipton Martin and David Shields are both signing books out where everyone has been signing books all day, right out the door. And then the next round table starts at 3. So we'll see you back here.